Stefan Volkov hadn't touched his bourbon in 40 minutes. The Pappy Van Winkle sat untouched, ice slowly drowning, while Chicago's elite swirled around the VIP section of the Langham's Grand Ballroom like sharks in designer gowns. They laughed too loud, smiled too wide, and pretended they didn't know the man sitting alone controlled every shadow in this city. 12 years since Katya bled out in his arms. 12 years since a bullet meant for him found his baby sister's chest instead. And still, every gala, every event, every room full of glittering strangers felt like standing at her grave. His fingers closed around his car keys. He'd done enough. Made his appearance. Let the right people see that Stefan Volkov still owned the ports, the casinos, the darkness. Time to disappear. Excuse me, mister. 2 boys. Identical. Maybe 7. Brown curls uncombed, blue eyes too sharp for their age, white shirts carefully ironed but already wrinkled from a long night of waiting. They stared at him like soldiers reporting for duty. You lost? Stefan's voice came out flat. Need help finding your mom? We found you on purpose. The left one lifted his chin. You're the only one here who looks dangerous enough. Stefan almost smiled. Almost. Dangerous enough for what? They leaned in close. He caught the smell of cheap soap and hidden candy. Their whispers hit him like bullets. Can you pretend to be our dad? Just for a few minutes. There's a man scaring our mom. She won't say it, but we know. She always pretends she's fine. She's not fine. Stefan's eyes followed where they'd glanced. Near the service entrance, a woman in black catering uniform, trapped between a supply cart and a man in a $3,000 suit. Tony Russo, his enemy's son, her shoulders curved inward, her smile frozen, her eyes searching for an exit that didn't exist. Stefan knew that look. He'd seen it on Katya's face the night the monsters came. Please. The quieter boy's voice cracked. Mom gives us her food when she thinks we're not looking. She works 2 jobs and never complains. She deserves one night where nobody makes her feel small. Stefan looked at these children who'd walked straight up to the most dangerous man in the room because they believed he could save their mother. He thought of Katya, of every promise he'd broken, of the grave he still visited every Sunday. His hand released the keys. What's her name? Hope exploded across their faces. Emma Lawson. She's the best mom in the world. She just doesn't know it yet. Stefan rose to his full 6'2", straightened his tie, signaled Theo and Jonas. Then let's go remind her. If this story touched your heart, hit like, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Now what happens when Stefan Volkov walks up to Emma Lawson and tells Tony Russo she's with him? Stefan moved through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. No one touched him. No one dared stand in his path. Politicians who had been laughing moments earlier fell silent. Businessmen who had been clapping one another on the back stepped aside. The music kept playing, but the room seemed to sink into stillness as Stefan Volkov headed toward the service door with Theo and Jonas close behind him. Tony Russo was standing far too close to Emma, one hand braced against the wall beside her head, his mouth saying something that made her force a smile, while her eyes pleaded for someone to save her. He didn't see Stefan coming. He was too busy savoring the fear of his prey. Russo. A single word. Stefan's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a blade. Tony turned, the smile still clinging to his lips, then froze when he realized who was standing in front of him. Volkov. He pulled his hand away from the wall as if he'd touched fire. I didn't know she was yours. Stefan didn't look at Tony. He was looking at Emma. She stood there with wide brown eyes stunned, the drink tray trembling lightly in her hands, unable to understand why the most feared boss in Chicago was standing in front of her like a fortress. He stepped closer, placed a hand on her back as naturally as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. The warmth from his palm seeped through the thin fabric of her uniform. She stiffened, but didn't step away. She's with me, Stefan said, his eyes never leaving Tony. And I don't like the way you were talking to her. Tony Russo swallowed. He was the son of Frank Moreno, the heir to the largest Italian Mafia empire in Chicago. But in front of Stefan Volkov, he was just a boy trying not to shake. I'm sorry. He stepped back again. I didn't mean any disrespect. Please send my regards to her father. Stefan almost laughed at the misunderstanding. Tony thought Emma was the daughter of someone important, someone from the underworld Stefan was protecting. He didn't know she was just a catering server trying to earn enough to cover this month's rent. I will, Stefan replied coolly. Now go. Tony Russo turned and left without daring to look back. His bodyguards hurried after him like chicks chasing a mother hen. The room began to buzz with whispers. Who is that girl? Stefan Volkov has a new woman. Who is she that made him appear like that? Emma was still standing there, her heart pounding like a war drum, completely unsure what had just happened. She was about to say something when two small shapes rushed in from behind Stefan. Mom. Mason and Miles wrapped their arms around her waist, their faces glowing like they'd just completed the most important mission of their lives. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What are you doing here? She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she checked the two boys. I told you to stay in the staff room. You promised me. I'm sorry, Mom, Miles said, though his voice carried no real remorse. But that man scared you. So Mason and I went to find someone to help. Emma looked up at Stefan, and everything began to rearrange itself in her mind. He didn't know her. He had no reason to help her. Yet somehow her 7-year-old sons had convinced the most dangerous mafia boss in the city to play their father. Who are you? Emma stood, instinctively pulling the boys behind her. Why did you help us? Stefan studied her for a long moment. This was the first time he'd looked at her up close. A face worn but resilient, brown eyes warm yet guarded, a mother ready to place herself between her children and any danger, even when that danger had just saved her. Because they asked me to, Stefan said, and because I hate Tony Russo. Emma didn't know how to respond to that answer. She was about to say thank you, about to apologize for her children bothering him, about to say they didn't need his help. But before she could open her mouth, Theo stepped forward and whispered something into Stefan's ear that made the boss's face harden. Stefan turned back to Emma, and in those cold gray eyes she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Ms. Lawson, he said slowly and carefully, I'm afraid you won't be able to go home tonight. Emma felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Not go home, she repeated it, her voice trembling. What are you saying? Stefan didn't answer right away. He signaled for Theo to lead them out of the ballroom. Through a staff door Emma knew well because she had used it hundreds of times before. But this time she passed through it in a different role. Not as a server, but as someone being escorted by men with guns hidden beneath their tailored jackets. They stopped in an empty corridor, cold fluorescent lights replacing the warm glow of the gala candles. Mason and Miles clung tightly to Emma's hands, their eyes darting between their mother and the unfamiliar man, beginning to realize that their plan might have gone much further than they'd intended. Tony Russo called his father, Stefan said plainly, without preamble. Frank Moreno. Do you know that name? Emma did. Who in Chicago didn't know that name? Frank Moreno was the head of the Italian Mafia family that had controlled half this city since before she was born. Stories about him were whispered in alleyways, in cheap bars where Rick used to drink himself into a rage before coming home and taking it out on her. I know. Emma swallowed hard. But what does that have to do with me? Stefan studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. When I stepped in to protect you in front of Tony, in our world, that means you belong to me. Not a girlfriend, not an acquaintance, protected property. And Frank Moreno is now wondering who that property is. Emma felt sick. Property. She hated that word. Rick used to say it about her. You're mine. You belong to me. No one touches what's mine. I'm not anyone's property, Emma said, her voice hardening. I'm taking my children home. If that Moreno wants answers, I'll tell him I don't know you, that he made a mistake. She moved toward the door, but Theo stepped into her path, not rough, but not moving either. Ms. Lawson, Stefan said, his voice still calm, but something like patience wearing thin beneath it. Moreno doesn't ask. He investigates. Right now, his people are finding out who you are, where you live, what you do, how many children you have. And when he discovers you're just a catering server with no connection to me at all, what do you think he'll believe? Emma didn't answer, but she knew. Moreno would think Stefan had deceived him, would think he'd been humiliated. And in their world, humiliation had to be paid for in blood. What will he do? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Best case, Stefan said. He kidnaps you to send me a message. Worst case, he does it to the boys. Mason and Miles tightened their grip on Emma's hands. They didn't understand everything the adults were saying, but they understood kidnapping. They understood danger. And they knew fear was moving through their mother because she was shaking. Mom, Mason said softly. I'm sorry. It's my fault. I asked him to help. Emma dropped to her knees and pulled both boys into her arms. No, It's not your fault. You just wanted to protect me. It's never your fault." She looked up at Stefan, and in her eyes was the fury of a mother backed into a corner. "What do you want?" 2 weeks, Stefan said. "Give me 2 weeks to clean this up. I'll make sure Moreno understands that touching you means touching me. After that, when things settle down, you can go wherever you want." Emma laughed bitterly. "And during those 2 weeks, where are we? In some basement of yours. In a gilded cage. In my penthouse," Stefan said evenly, "with security 24 hours a day. Food, clothes, everything the boys need. You don't have to do anything except stay there until it's safe." Emma wanted to refuse. Every cell in her body was screaming not to trust men, not to trust free help, not to step into the territory of a monster no matter how polished he appeared. But she had no choice. She looked down at Mason and Miles, at the blue eyes waiting, trusting, completely dependent on her decision. She couldn't gamble their lives for the sake of pride. "Fine," Emma stood, her voice like stone. 2 weeks, not a day more. "And don't ever think this means I belong to you." Stefan nodded, and something flickered in his eyes. Not victory. Almost respect. "Theo," he said, "get the car ready. We're going home." Home. The word echoed strangely in the air. Emma wondered when the last time she'd had a place she could call home was. Maybe before Rick. Maybe never. She took her son's hands, followed the man whose name she hadn't known minutes earlier, and prayed she hadn't just stepped from one trap into another. Stefan's penthouse sat on the top floor of a building he owned outright. A private elevator, a private security code, and 3 layers of guards before anyone could reach the door. When the elevator doors opened, Emma felt as if she had stepped into another world. 500 square meters of open space with soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass revealing the full sweep of Chicago at night. The city lights glittered below like a blanket of stars. Yet inside the apartment there was a strange coldness. The interior was minimalist, all gray and black, not a single photograph on the walls, not a single personal object, as if no one truly lived here, as if this were only a place to exist, not a place to belong. "Whoa," Miles breathed, his eyes wide. "Do you live here alone all the time, mister? Aren't you scared of ghosts?" Stefan stopped and looked down at the boy, his expression unreadable. No one asked him questions like that. For 12 years, no one had dared ask him anything that wasn't about business. "Ghosts aren't real," Stefan replied, his voice neither cold nor warm. "I'm not afraid of things that don't exist, but I am afraid of things that do." Miles tilted his head. "Like what?" Stefan didn't answer. He turned to Theo and signaled for the guest rooms to be prepared, then led the 3 of them down a long hallway. "This is the boys' room." Stefan opened a door to a spacious bedroom with 2 single beds, navy blue sheets, everything brand new as if freshly prepared. "Your room is next door, Ms. Lawson. There's a connecting door if you want it, and a lock on your side if you need it." Emma nodded stiffly without saying thank you. She wasn't ready to thank the man who had pulled her into this chaos, even if he was also the only one who could pull her out. She took the boys into the room, helped them change into pajamas that someone had already prepared in sizes that were almost perfect, and lay beside them until both Mason and Miles were fast asleep. Then she slipped out, closed the door gently, and walked toward the living area. She needed air. She needed to think. She needed to understand how her life had turned upside down in the span of a few hours. She didn't know that Stefan was sitting in the adjoining study. The door left open just enough for him to see her through the narrow gap, and she didn't know he had signaled Theo not to interrupt, so he could observe this woman alone. Emma stood before the glass, looking out over the city. Her shoulders sagged. The armor of resilience she had worn all night began to crack, and then she cried. There was no sound, no sobbing, just trembling shoulders and silent tears sliding down her cheeks. She cried like someone accustomed to crying alone, accustomed to never letting anyone see her weakness, accustomed to swallowing her tears so she could keep fighting the next day. Stefan felt his chest tighten. He had seen many people cry, enemies begging for their lives, allies breaking down after betrayal. But he had never seen anyone cry like this. As if tears were a luxury she rarely allowed herself. Soft footsteps drew his attention. Mason stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes as he looked around for his mother. He couldn't see Emma in the living area because of the angle, but he could see Stefan in the study by the light spilling out. "Uncle Stefan." Mason stepped inside, his voice still thick with sleep. I can't sleep. Stefan didn't know what to do. For 12 years, he hadn't spoken to children. For 12 years, no one had called him uncle with that kind of trust. Why? He asked, trying to keep his voice normal. I'm worried about my mom. Mason climbed onto the chair across from Stefan without asking. Mom pretends she's okay, but I know she's not. She thinks I don't see it, but I see everything. Stefan tilted his head, curious despite himself. What do you see? Mom doesn't eat, Mason said, his voice dropping as if he were revealing the biggest secret in the world. Last week the fridge was empty. Mom cooked noodles for me and Miles. Then she said she ate at work. But I know she lied. I counted. Mom didn't eat anything for 3 days. Something inside Stefan shattered. A woman starving herself for 3 days so her children could eat. A mother working 2 jobs and still unable to afford food for her family. And him, with an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, nearly walking away tonight because he didn't want to get involved. Why are you telling me this? Stefan asked. Because you're the only grown-up who doesn't fake smile when you talk to me, Mason said, looking at him with blue eyes far too old for his age. And because I think you can help my mom. You're rich. Can you buy food for her? Not for me. I can go without. Just for my mom. Stefan looked at the 7-year-old boy asking for food for his mother instead of himself, and he thought of Katya. He thought of how his sister had been the same, always thinking of others first, always placing herself last, always sacrificing until there was nothing left to give. I'll take care of it, Stefan heard himself say. For you, for your brother, and for your mother. No one is going hungry anymore. Mason smiled, for the first time since they had met. The smile of a child who believes everything will be okay because there is a grown-up he can trust. Stefan didn't know if he deserved that trust, but when he looked through the crack in the door and saw Emma still standing there, shoulders shaking, alone in the dark, he made a decision. Not 2 weeks. Not because of Moreno or pride or anything tied to the underworld. He would protect them because a 7-year-old boy had reminded him of something he had forgotten long ago. That there are things worth fighting for beyond power and territory. Go to sleep, Stefan said softly. Tomorrow I'll make you a really good breakfast. Mason slid off the chair and headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. Uncle Stefan, I'm glad I picked you tonight. You look scary, but you're not bad. I know. The boy disappeared behind the door. Stefan sat there alone, in a penthouse far too large for one man, and for the first time in 12 years, he didn't feel completely alone. Stefan left the penthouse at 6 in the morning before anyone woke up. He left instructions for the chef to prepare a full breakfast, stressing that there had to be enough food for 3 people and that the woman must eat even if she refused. Then he stepped into the black SUV waiting outside, his face like ice, ready to return to the world he truly belonged to. The warehouse in the industrial district on the south side of Chicago looked ordinary from the outside. Old brick walls, rusted steel doors, no sign. But inside it was one of Stefan's operational bases. A place where conversations no one wanted were often held. Today there was one of those conversations. Danny Kowalski, 43 years old, worked for Stefan for 7 years, in charge of port logistics, and 2 weeks ago he started selling information to Frank Moreno. Stefan stood in front of Danny, his hands tied to the chair, his face swollen from a private talk Jonas had already had with him. Stefan didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just stood there, looking at the traitor with the eyes of a man who had seen too much betrayal to be surprised by it anymore. Why? Stefan asked. One word. Danny trembled, tears mixing with blood from the cut on his forehead. Money. They paid double. I have debts. My child needs surgery. I had no choice. Stefan thought of Emma starving herself for 3 days so her children could eat. Thought of how she worked 2 jobs and never once considered betraying anyone to get money. There are people who truly have no choice, and there are people who choose the easy road and call it having no choice. He knew which kind Danny was. What did you tell Moreno? Stefan asked. Danny swallowed. About shipping schedules, about cargo, and about the girl last night. They asked who she was. Stefan froze. His muscles tightened like drawn wire. What did you say? I didn't know much. Danny spoke fast as if speed could save his life. Just that you claimed her in front of Tony. That she has 2 kids. That you took her back to the penthouse. They're investigating her, trying to find out who she is. Stefan turned to Theo, his eyes going dark. Increased security around the building. No one in or out without the new code. and find out who Moreno is using to watch us." Then he looked back at Danny. He said nothing more, just nodded to Jonas and walked out, the steel door closing behind him and cutting off the sounds that followed. That was Stefan's life. That was who he was. A monster in a world of monsters. He didn't apologize for it. He didn't know any other way. On the drive back, Theo brought more bad news. Moreno had sent people to watch the building. A gray sedan parked on the corner since early morning, 2 men inside, cameras photographing every car coming and going. They hadn't acted. Not yet. But they were waiting, gathering information, looking for weakness. And Stefan hated this feeling, the feeling of having a weakness for them to find. By the time he returned to the penthouse, it was late afternoon. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with his body. Tired of betrayal, of enemies, of a world that never allowed him rest. The elevator doors opened. Stefan stepped out and stopped. Something was different. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Sound. His penthouse, silent like a tomb for 12 years, now had sound. Children's laughter drifting from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, Emma's voice saying something he couldn't quite hear, but it no longer carried the tension from the night before. Stefan walked toward the kitchen, his steps slowing, as if he were afraid that if he moved too fast, the sound would vanish. He stood in the doorway and looked in. Miles was standing on a high chair, his hands smeared with flour, trying to shape something while Mason pointed and told him he was doing it wrong. Emma stood beside them, an apron hastily tied over her server uniform, strands of hair loose and dusted with flour, and she was smiling. Not the forced smile she'd worn all night, a real one, small, tired, but real. "Uncle Stefan." Miles spotted him first. The boy's face lit up like sunrise. "You're back. Look." He held up something Stefan took a few seconds to recognize as a cookie. It was misshapen, ugly, dusted unevenly with flour, probably burned on one side. But Miles held it like a championship trophy. "I made it myself. I saved yours. It looks bad, but it's really good. Mom says taste matters more than looks." Stefan stood there, not knowing what to do. No one had ever saved anything for him. No one had ever thought of him when he wasn't there. No one had ever been happy he came home. He stepped forward and took the crooked cookie from Miles's hand. It felt heavier than he expected. Or maybe that was the weight of something else. "Thank you," Stefan said, and he realized his voice had gone rough. "I'll eat it after dinner." Miles grinned. Mason nodded solemnly, as if witnessing an important ritual. "And Emma?" Emma looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. No fear. No anger. Something else. As if she were seeing something he couldn't see himself. "There's chicken soup," she said softly, "if you want to eat with us." It wasn't an invitation. It was a door left ajar. Stefan walked through it. He sat at the table with them, the crooked cookie set beside his plate, and for the first time in 12 years, he didn't eat alone. A week passed faster than Emma expected. She began to adjust to the strange rhythm of life in the penthouse, to the certainty of a full refrigerator, to Mason and Miles having a safe place to play instead of a cramped apartment with a broken lock. But she still couldn't get used to Stefan Volkov. He was a mystery she couldn't decode. By day, he vanished into a world she didn't want to know, returning with tired eyes and hands that sometimes bore small cuts he never explained. By night, he sat alone in his study, the desk lamp casting shadows across his sharp features as he read or stared out the glass, as if searching for something lost long ago. On the 8th night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay, listening to the steady breathing of her sons in the next room, then quietly slipped out of bed. She needed water, she needed air, she needed escape from the thoughts spinning in her head. The living room was dark, lit only by a faint glow from the study. Emma was about to turn back when Stefan's voice reached her. "You can't sleep?" She stopped, hesitated, then walked toward the study door. Stefan sat in a leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the main lights off with only the small desk lamp on. He didn't look up when she entered. "I can't either," he said, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. "I rarely sleep before 3 in the morning." Emma didn't know whether to stay or leave, but her feet didn't move. She stood there in borrowed pajamas that hung too loose, her hair falling over her shoulders, feeling more vulnerable than she had in a long time. "What do you think about so late?" she asked, not knowing why she did. Stefan was silent for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. Do you want something to drink?" Emma shook her head but sat down. The distance between them was just far enough to feel safe, just close enough for honesty. I think about my sister, Stefan said, his eyes fixed on the whiskey. Katya. She would be 28 this year if she were alive. Maybe she would have married. Maybe she would have had children. Maybe she would have had the ordinary life she always dreamed of. Emma said nothing, only listened. This was the first time Stefan had spoken about anything personal, and she knew that if she reacted wrong, this door would close forever. She died because of me, Stefan continued, his voice flat as if reading the weather, though his hand tightened around the glass. 12 years ago. Someone wanted to send me a message, so they came to the house. I wasn't there. Katya was. She was 16. She was doing homework when they broke in. He stopped and took a deep breath. The bullet was meant for me, but she stepped in front of me when I got there. She died in my arms before the ambulance arrived. Emma felt tears rise but forced them back. She knew Stefan didn't need her tears. He needed someone to listen. I'm sorry, she said, and she truly was. Don't. Stefan shook his head. I didn't tell you for pity. I told you because you look at me like I'm a monster. And you're right. I am. But I wasn't always. There was a time when I was just the brother of a girl who loved books and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Silence stretched between them. Not heavy. Just two people standing at the edge of their pasts, deciding whether to jump. Emma jumped first. Rick didn't disappear, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I mean, he did eventually, but before that he stayed long enough to destroy everything. Stefan looked up, his attention fully on her. He started hitting me 6 months after Mason and Miles were born, Emma continued, staring into the distance. At first it was slaps, then punches, then worse. He said it was my fault. I didn't cook well enough. I didn't keep the house clean. I wasn't pretty enough. I believed him. For 2 years I believed I deserved it. Stefan's hand clenched into a fist on the armrest, but he didn't interrupt. One night he came home drunk, lost money gambling, owed a lot. He beat me in front of Mason and Miles. They were 2 years old and they were crying, calling for me, and I couldn't protect them because I was on the floor and couldn't get up. Emma blinked as a tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. He left that night. Left behind a debt of $200,000 in creditors knocking every week. For 3 years I ran, changed addresses 5 times, worked under false names, lived in fear that one day he'd come back or the people he owed would find us. She looked up at Stefan. So when you said I belonged to you, when you said I was property, I reacted like that, because I already belonged to someone once, and it almost killed me. Stefan stood. Emma thought he was going to leave, but he didn't. He stepped closer, lowered himself onto one knee, so their eyes were level. You're not property, he said, his voice low and certain. Not mine, not anyone's. And if Rick is still alive, if he ever dares to show up in front of you, I'll make sure he never lays a hand on you or the boys again. Not because you belong to me, because no one deserves to live in fear. Emma looked into his cold, gray eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see the monster. She saw a man scarred like her, hurting like her, lonely like her. You're afraid of something too, she whispered. Aren't you? Stefan didn't answer with words. He only looked at her for a long moment, then stood and turned toward the window. I'm afraid I've forgotten how not to be alone, he said into the darkness. That I've been a shadow for so long I don't know if I'm still human. Emma stood and moved beside him. She didn't touch him, but she stayed. You are, she said softly. I see it. My children see it. Stefan turned to her, and in that moment, in the dim study lit only by a desk lamp and filled with 2 wounded souls, they looked at each other as if truly seeing for the first time. Not a monster and a victim. Not a mafia boss and a server. Just Stefan and Emma, 2 lonely people standing at the edge of the dark, whispering to each other that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be alone forever. The following afternoon, Stefan was sitting in his study reviewing Theo's report on Moreno's people when a soft knock sounded at the door. He thought it was Emma, but when he looked up, he saw Mason standing in the doorway, his hands clasped in front of his stomach as if preparing for an important conversation. Can I come in, Uncle Stefan? Stefan nodded and closed his laptop. Mason stepped inside with a seriousness that didn't fit a 7-year-old, climbed onto the chair across from Stefan's desk, as he had done many times over the past week. I have something I want to ask, the boy said, looking straight at Stefan without blinking. Stefan tilted his head. Go ahead. Mason was quiet for a moment, as if arranging the right words in his mind. Then he asked, that night at the party, you could have said no. You could have sent me and Miles away. Why did you help us? Stefan hadn't expected that question. He was used to having his motives questioned by enemies, by allies, by people searching for weakness. But being asked by a 7-year-old why he did something good left him without a ready answer. Because you and your brother needed help, Stefan said, and I could help. But there were lots of other people there who could have helped too, Mason countered, his voice surprisingly sharp. There was the man in the blue suit who laughed a lot, the gray-haired man with the gold watch, the younger man with the expensive phone. Why didn't I ask them? Stefan studied the boy, genuinely curious. So why did you choose me? Mason looked down at his hands for a moment, then lifted his gaze, blue eyes far older than his age. Because they all looked happy. They were laughing, talking. They had people with them. I didn't think they would understand. Stefan blinked. Understand what? What it feels like to be alone, Mason said. What it feels like to sit in a crowd and still not belong anywhere. What it feels like to smile while being sad inside. I saw you sitting alone with a drink you weren't drinking, looking at everyone the way my mom looks at guests at parties, like you were there but not really there. Something tightened in Stefan's throat. A 7-year-old had seen straight through the mask he had worn for 12 years. The mask no one in Chicago's underworld had ever dared to look past. I chose you because you looked lonely like my mom, Mason went on, his voice softer now. I thought maybe lonely people should stay together. Maybe they can help each other not be lonely, at least for one night. Stefan couldn't speak. He sat there facing a boy who had found a truth philosophers spend lifetimes chasing. That loneliness recognizes loneliness. That broken hearts can heal each other. That sometimes the one who saves others is the one who needs saving most. Are you mad at me? Mason asked, worried by Stefan's silence, for pulling my mom and us into something dangerous. Stefan shook his head slowly. No, I'm not mad. Then what are you thinking? Stefan looked at the boy for a long moment. I'm thinking you might be the smartest 7-year-old I've ever met. And I'm thinking your mother raised you very well. Mason smiled, the rare smile of a child who had grown up too fast. My mom is the best person in the world. She just doesn't know it. You already said that, Stefan remembered. The first night we met. Because it's true, Mason shrugged. I'll keep saying it until she believes it, and until someone else says it too. The boy slid off the chair, ran to the door, then stopped and turned back. I'm glad I chose you, Uncle Stefan. You're lonely, but you're not bad. Like my mom. I think you and my mom are more alike than you think. Then he disappeared through the doorway, leaving Stefan alone in the study as the light faded with the setting sun. That night Stefan didn't sleep. He sat by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand but untouched, watching the city flicker below. Mason's words echoed in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. You looked lonely like my mom. Lonely people should stay together. He had spent 12 years building an empire, 12 years becoming untouchable, 12 years making sure no one could hurt him the way that night Katya died had hurt him. But a 7-year-old boy had seen what the entire underworld had missed. That beneath all the power and fear, Stefan Volkov was just a lonely man searching for someone who understood him. And the most frightening thing was that the boy was right. 2 weeks passed faster than either of them realized. Stefan counted each day, not because he wanted them to leave, but because he feared the moment they would. He had grown used to Mason and Miles's laughter echoing through the penthouse every morning, used to coming home to someone waiting, used to dinners that were no longer silent, used to Emma. On the final night of the 2 weeks, Stefan asked Emma to come to the study after the boys had fallen asleep. He had prepared this speech all day, but when she stepped inside with her hair still damp from the shower, wearing the oversized sweater he had bought because the penthouse ran cold, every word disappeared. You wanted to talk? Emma asked as she sat in the chair that had become hers during their late-night conversations. Stefan opened the desk drawer, took out a thick envelope and a key, and placed them on the desk between them. The 2 weeks are over, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I've settled things with Moreno. He understands that you and the boys aren't targets. You're safe to leave. Emma looked at the envelope without touching it. What is it? A new apartment in Lincoln Park, Stefan explained. Good security, close to good schools for Mason and Miles. The rent's paid a year in advance, And the envelope has enough money so you don't have to work 2 jobs anymore, at least until you're settled. Emma stayed still. She didn't speak or react, just stared at the envelope as if it were something alive. You don't have to pay it back, Stefan added because her silence made him uneasy. This isn't charity. Consider it compensation for dragging you into this mess. You deserve a new start. Emma looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes Stefan couldn't read. You want us to go? Stefan felt as if someone had punched him in the chest. I want you to have a choice, he said carefully. 2 weeks ago you didn't. Now you do. That apartment is yours no matter what you decide. No matter what I decide, Emma repeated, tilting her head. That means there's another option. Stefan was silent. He didn't know how to say that the penthouse hadn't felt cold since they arrived, that he'd slept more in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 12 years combined, that he didn't want them to go but had no right to keep them. You can stay, Stefan said at last, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. If you want to. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here. Emma studied him for a long moment, then did something Stefan didn't expect. She laughed, not mocking, just light, as if a weight had been lifted. Do you know what I was going to say? She asked. I spent all day preparing to convince you to let us stay longer. I came up with reasons. The boys need stability. I need time to find new work. The old apartment isn't safe. All reasonable, practical reasons. Stefan blinked. So you want to stay? Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. 2 weeks ago I came here like a prisoner, she said with her back to him. I hated everything. I hated this place for being too big. I hated depending on someone. I hated feeling out of control. She turned back to Stefan. But then I saw Mason smile. Really smile. Not the one he forces when I ask if he's okay. I saw Miles run without worrying about bothering neighbors, because we weren't in an apartment with paper-thin walls anymore. I saw my boys eat full meals, sleep through the night, and ask silly questions about sports cars and guard dogs instead of asking why their mother cries at night. Emma stepped closer, stopping in front of Stefan. My children have never been as happy as they've been these 2 weeks. Never. Not because of the expensive penthouse or good food or new clothes, but because for the first time in 3 years, they feel safe. And so do I. Stefan stood, the space between them reduced to a single step. I can't promise a normal life, he said quietly. My world is dangerous. There will always be enemies. There will always be risk. I'm not looking for normal, Emma replied. I had normal with Rick and it almost killed me. I don't need normal. I need safety. I need someone who sees my children as having value. I need someone who sees me as a person, not property. She hesitated for a heartbeat. And I need to know if you really want us to stay, or if you're just being polite before showing us the door. Stefan met Emma's gaze, the brown eyes that no longer held fear when they looked at him, no longer guarded themselves in his presence. This place was silent for 12 years, he said. 12 years of coming home to no one. 12 years of eating alone, sleeping alone, existing alone. These 2 weeks were the first time there's been laughter here. The first time I didn't dread opening the door because I knew someone would be waiting inside. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently touched Emma's cheek, his fingers trembling as if he'd forgotten how to touch someone without causing harm. I want you to stay. Not for 2 weeks, not for 2 months. Stay until you don't want to anymore, and when that day comes, I'll let you go. But don't go today. Don't go when I've just learned how not to be alone. Emma didn't answer with words. She placed her hand over Stefan's chest where his heart was beating faster than usual and nodded. A small nod, but enough. Enough for Stefan to know that for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't facing the darkness alone. A month had passed since the night Emma decided to stay. Everything slowly settled into routine. Breakfast together. Stefan leaving for work during the day and returning in time for dinner. Mason and Miles began remote learning, with a tutor Stefan hired to ensure their safety, while things were not fully stable. Emma started working remotely for a publishing company that Theo had quietly arranged. Editing books from her laptop in the sunlit living room, she refused to let Stefan support her completely. Independence was something she would protect at all costs, and Stefan respected that. He respected her in ways Rick never had. Everything was going well, until that afternoon. Stefan was at the port overseeing a shipment when Theo approached with a face more tense than usual. You need to see this. Theo handed Stefan a tablet. On the screen was a surveillance image. A man around 30, dirty brown hair, scruffy beard, talking to one of Moreno's men outside a bar on the south side. Stefan frowned. Who is that? Theo swallowed. Rick Lawson, Emma's ex-husband. Stefan felt his blood freeze and boil in the same instant. What is he doing in Chicago? Theo answered. He's selling information to Moreno. About Emma. About the boys. Where they are. Their schedules. Anything he can dig up from old contacts. Moreno is paying him to cover gambling debts. Stefan ground his teeth. How long has he been here? About 2 weeks, Theo admitted. We only confirmed it today when one of our sources reported it. He's good at hiding. 3 years running from creditors probably taught him how to disappear. And he only dared to creep back into Chicago 2 weeks ago, after hearing rumors that Emma might be working the high-end gala circuits again. Bring him to the warehouse, Stefan ordered, his voice like ice. I want to talk. An hour later, Stefan stood in the familiar warehouse, looking at the man who had once beaten Emma sitting bound to a chair, his face bruised from an unfriendly meeting with Jonas. Rick Lawson looked more pathetic than Stefan expected. Thin, sallow, the darting eyes of a compulsive gambler always searching for an exit. Hard to believe this was the man who had terrified Emma enough to run for 3 years. You're Volkov, Rick said, his voice shaking. I've heard about you. Please, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just need money. Stefan said nothing, only watched. His silence was more frightening than any threat. Emma is my ex-wife, Rick continued, grasping for anything that might save him. The kids are my children. I have a right to know where they are. I'm their father. Stefan stepped closer and lowered himself onto one knee so their eyes were level. He spoke slowly, each word cutting like a blade. You left when they were 2 years old. You beat their mother in front of them. You left debts that forced them to run for 3 years. You're not a father. You're just sperm that finished its job and should have disappeared. Rick went pale. You don't have the right. I have every right, Stefan stood. Because they're mine now, and you sold information about them to my enemy. In my world, that's a death sentence. Rick's eyes widened in terror. Please, I'll leave. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Please don't kill me. Stefan drew his gun from the holster at his side and checked it slowly, deliberately letting Rick see every movement. He had decided. This man had to die. Not because he was a major threat, but because he was a reminder of every pain Emma had endured. Because he was the ghost she feared would return. Because as long as he breathed, Emma would never truly be safe. Stefan's phone vibrated. A message from Emma. Can you come home early? I made pumpkin soup. Stefan stared at the message for a long moment. Then he looked at Rick. Then he thought of Mason and Miles. Of how they would look at him if they knew he had killed their biological father. Even if that man didn't deserve the title. He thought of Emma. Of how she had learned to trust him. Of how she would look at him if she knew his hands were stained with the blood of the man who had once been her husband. Keep him here, Stefan ordered Theo. I need to talk to Emma first. He returned to the penthouse as the sun was setting. Emma was in the kitchen, apron tied around her waist, hair pinned up, looking more peaceful than ever. Mason and Miles were doing homework at the dining table, arguing over a math problem. You're home, Emma smiled when she saw him. The soup's almost ready. Do you want to eat now, or... She stopped when she saw Stefan's face. What's wrong? Stefan looked at the boys, then at Emma. We need to talk. Alone. 10 minutes later, they stood in the study with the door closed. Stefan told her everything. About Rick. About him selling information. About him being in Stefan's warehouse awaiting judgment. Emma listened, her face pale. But she didn't cry. She had cried enough over Rick Lawson. You're going to kill him, she said. Not a question. Stefan nodded. It's the safest solution. But I wanted you to know first. Emma was silent for a long moment. Then she said, her voice trembling slightly, Don't. Stefan blinked. You're asking me not to kill him. Emma shook her head. Not because he deserves to live. He doesn't. But Mason and Miles. One day they'll grow up. They'll ask about their biological father. And I don't want to lie. I don't want to say their father died because the man their mother loves killed him. She looked up at Stefan, her eyes red but steady. I'm not asking for Rick. I'm asking for the boys. For their future. For the chance that one day they can face their past without being crushed by it. Stefan looked at Emma, at the woman who put her children's future above hatred, above fear, above everything Rick had done to her. And he realized this was why he loved her. All right, he said at last. his voice strained. "I won't kill him, but he's going to prison. I have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years for abuse, child abandonment, and selling information to a criminal organization. He'll never come near you or the boys again." Emma let out a breath, her shoulders sagging as if a crushing weight had been lifted. "Thank you." Stefan stepped forward and gently lifted her chin. "But if he ever gets out," he said slowly, "if he dares to appear in front of you or the boys, I won't ask you again." Emma nodded. "If that day comes, I won't stop you." They stood there in the dimming study. Two people who had walked through too much darkness to remain naive, still trying to find the least bloody path through a world with no perfect choices. The weeks that followed passed like a dream no one dared believe was real. Rick was arrested and handed over to the police with enough evidence to keep him in prison for 20 years. And for the first time in 3 years, Emma slept without jolting awake from nightmares. She no longer feared the doorbell, no longer feared unfamiliar shadows outside the window, no longer feared the past catching up to her. And in that peace, something began to take root between her and Stefan. It started with late-night conversations in the study after Mason and Miles had fallen asleep. Stefan talked about his childhood in Chicago, about his father as the first generation to build the empire from nothing, about his mother dying of cancer when he was 12, about how he had been forced to grow up too soon. Emma talked about her youthful dream of becoming a writer, about meeting Rick in college and believing it was love, about discovering she was pregnant 2 weeks after Rick hit her for the first time, and choosing to stay because she thought a child would change everything. They shared scars no one else had seen, fears no one else had heard, dreams both believed had died long ago, and with each passing night, the distance between them narrowed a little more. Not physical distance, but the invisible walls each had built around their hearts. Stefan learned that Emma liked to read early in the morning while the house still slept, that she hated the smell of roses because Rick used to bring her roses every time he apologized after hitting her, that she could laugh until she cried at Miles's ridiculous stories. Emma learned that Stefan kept one of Katya's bracelets in his desk drawer, that he feared storms because the night Katya died, the rain had been relentless, that beneath the frightening cold exterior, he was only a brother trying to live for a sister who never had the chance. They hadn't kissed, hadn't touched in ways that crossed the line of friendship, but they both knew something was changing, something forming between midnight conversations and glances that lingered longer than necessary. Mason and Miles were the first to notice. One evening at dinner, Miles suddenly spoke up. "Stefan, can you pass the salt?" The table fell silent. Emma stared at her son, surprised. "Miles, you should call him Uncle Stefan." "Why?" Miles tilted his head, puzzled. "Stefan isn't related to me, but he lives with us every day. He eats with us. He read me a story last night. He's more like a dad than an uncle." Mason nodded in agreement. "Stefan isn't an uncle. Stefan is Stefan." None of the adults spoke. Stefan looked at the boys with an expression Emma couldn't read, but she saw his fingers tighten around his chopsticks until they went white. "Boys," Emma started, but Stefan interrupted. "It's all right," he said, his voice slightly rough. "You can call me Stefan, if you want." Miles beamed. "Then Stefan, pass the salt." Stefan handed him the salt shaker, and when their hands touched, Miles wrapped his small fingers around Stefan's and didn't let go for the rest of the meal. That night, after Mason and Miles were asleep, Emma found Stefan standing by the living room window, looking out at the city the way he did whenever he needed to think. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Stefan turned and Emma saw his eyes were a little red. "No one has called me by my name since Katya was alive," he said. "To everyone else, I'm Volkov, the boss, the man they fear or the man they need. No one calls me Stefan like I'm just a normal person." Emma stepped closer and placed her hand gently on his arm. "With us, you're Stefan. Just Stefan." He turned to her, and in that moment, all the walls disappeared. He was no longer a mafia boss, and she was no longer a woman on the run. They were simply two lonely people who had found each other in a sea of strangers. Stefan lifted his hand and touched Emma's cheek. She didn't pull away. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" she asked softly. "Family." Emma didn't answer with words. She leaned into his palm and closed her eyes, and for the first time in many years, she believed everything would be all right. But storms always follow calm days, and they didn't know that the greatest storm was already gathering just behind them. That afternoon should have been an ordinary day. Mason and Miles had begged their mother all week to let them go to the park near the building, and Emma finally agreed on the condition that Jonas and 2 other guards went with them. Stefan was at the port overseeing a shipment, Theo beside him as always. There were no signs that anything was wrong, no warnings, no intuition. Just a beautiful sunny afternoon in Chicago with 2 boys running across green grass while their mother sat on a stone bench watching them, and for the first time in many years feeling truly at peace. Then everything shattered in less than 60 seconds. A white van appeared from nowhere, crashing straight through the park fence at terrifying speed. Jonas reacted first, shoving Emma to the ground and throwing his body over hers just as the first gunshot rang out. The other 2 guards drew their weapons and returned fire, but they were outnumbered. 4, 5, 6 men dressed in black poured out of the van, spraying bullets at the security team. Emma screamed her son's names, but the gunfire swallowed her voice. She saw Mason and Miles about 20 meters away, frozen in fear, not knowing where to run. Jonas shouted, blood pouring from his left shoulder where a bullet had just torn through. "Run! Run now!" Mason reacted first. He grabbed his brother's hand and pulled Miles toward the trees at the back of the park. But they were 7-year-old children, with small legs, and their attackers were trained adults. One of the men caught up, grabbed Miles by the shirt and lifted him off the ground. Miles screamed, his legs kicking wildly in the air. Mason turned back, throwing punches and kicks at the man holding his brother. But he was shoved aside, rolling down into a shallow ditch by the road and lying still beneath tall grass. The kidnapper did not find Mason. He did not have time. Police sirens were already wailing in the distance. He threw Miles into the van, jumped in after him, and the vehicle vanished around the corner before Emma could even stand. No. Emma ran toward the van that was already gone, barefoot because her shoes had come off somewhere, her scream tearing through the air. "Miles, my son." No. She collapsed in the street, her knees slamming into the asphalt, but she felt no pain. She felt nothing but the terror ripping her chest apart. Jonas dragged himself to her side, blood soaking half his shirt. "Call Stefan," he said through broken breaths. "Call him now." Mason crawled out of the grass, his face smeared with mud, his eyes wide with shock. He staggered to his mother and clung to her, as if letting go would mean losing her too. "It's my fault," Mason cried. "I couldn't hold on to him. I ran. It's my fault." Emma pulled her son into her arms, tears streaming down her face, trying to say something comforting but unable to form words. She was dying from the inside out. 15 minutes later, Stefan arrived. He had driven through the city like a madman the moment Jonas called. When he reached the park, police had sealed off the area. An ambulance was taking Jonas away, and Emma sat on a stone bench holding Mason, both of them shaking uncontrollably. Stefan ran to them and dropped to his knees. His eyes swept over Emma, over Mason, searching for Miles and not finding him. His heart stopped. "Where is Miles?" Emma looked up at him, and her eyes told him everything. Something broke inside Stefan, a fear he had not felt in 12 years, not since the night Katya died in his arms, the fear of losing someone he loved. He stood and turned to Theo, who stood behind him holding a phone, his face drained of color. "Find out who did this," Stefan ordered, his voice cold as steel though his hands were shaking. "Find where they are holding Miles. Mobilize everyone. I want answers within 1 hour." He turned back to Mason and knelt so their eyes were level. "Mason, I need you to be strong. Can you tell me what happened? Did you see anything special? The license plate? Their faces? Anything?" Mason tried to speak through sobs. "A white van. No plates. 4 or 5 men. One had a snake tattoo on his neck. He took Miles. I hit him, but I was too weak. I couldn't hold him." Stefan placed a hand on Mason's shoulder and squeezed gently. "You did the right thing. You got away, and you survived. That's how we know what happened. This isn't your fault. Do you understand?" Mason did not answer. He just cried. Stefan's phone vibrated. An unknown number. He answered, and the voice on the other end made his blood boil. "Volkov," Frank Moreno said, his voice low and triumphant. "I think it's time we talk about the future." Stefan clenched his jaw. "If you touch one finger on that child," Moreno laughed. "The child is fine. For now. But I can't promise how long that will last if you don't cooperate." "What do you want?" "The port," Moreno said plainly. "Full control of the Lake Michigan port. In exchange for the boy. That's the only deal I'll accept." Stefan was silent for a second, then spoke, his voice so cold the air around him seemed to freeze. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Moreno. I will find where you're holding him. I will come there. And when I do, I won't negotiate. I will take the child back, and I will burn everything you have ever built. He ended the call before Moreno could respond. Emma looked at him, her eyes red but something burning inside them. Hope, trust. Bring Miles home, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I believe you. Stefan looked at her, at Mason clinging to his mother, and he swore a silent oath. He would bring Miles home, even if he had to burn all of Chicago to do it. 4 hours. Stefan needed only 4 hours to find where Moreno was hiding Miles. He mobilized every resource, called in every favor, threatened everyone who needed threatening, bribed everyone who could be bought. Information poured in like a flood, from low-level street soldiers picked up on corners, from eyes watching in the shadows, from people inside Moreno's organization willing to sell out their boss to save their own lives. An abandoned warehouse on the south side, an old industrial zone shut down 10 years ago, 20 guards on site, Tony Russo personally watching the child. Stefan listened to Theo's report without surprise. Tony. Of course it was Tony. Moreno's son had never forgotten the night he was humiliated at the party, when Stefan declared Emma was his in front of him. This was his revenge, through a 7-year-old child. Boss, Theo spoke as Stefan checked his weapon one last time. Moreno called back. He wants to negotiate. He agrees to meet at a neutral location. No negotiation. Stefan slid the gun into the holster at his side. We move tonight. But if we negotiate, Theo tried, we might get the child without bloodshed. Moreno is a businessman. He doesn't want a war. Stefan turned and looked at Theo, and in his cold gray eyes was something his loyal right hand had never seen before. Not the anger of a boss being challenged, but the fury of a father. They kidnapped a 7-year-old child, Stefan said slowly, every word deliberate. A child who trusted me to protect him. A child who called me by my name and asked if I wanted to eat a cookie he made himself. And you want me to sit down and negotiate with the people who did that? Theo fell silent. There will be no negotiation, Stefan continued. No deal. No compromise. Tonight I go there. I take Miles back, and I send Moreno a message that all of Chicago will remember for the rest of their lives. That anyone who touches the people of Stefan Volkov won't live long enough to regret it. He looked out the window. Rain had begun to fall, the first drops striking the glass like war drums. Gather everyone, Stefan ordered. We move in 1 hour. 1 hour later, Stefan's convoy tore through the rainy Chicago night. 7 black SUVs, 42 men armed to the teeth, all of them knowing tonight was a night of blood. Not for territory, not for money, but for a curly-haired boy who once walked up to a feared boss and asked if he would pretend to be a father. Stefan sat in the back seat, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond rain-streaked glass. He thought of Miles, of the boy's wide grin, of the way he held Stefan's finger through an entire dinner, of the small voice asking Stefan, "Can you pass the salt?" He thought of Emma sitting in the penthouse with Mason, waiting, praying, trusting him. And he thought of Katya, of the rainy night 12 years ago when his sister died in his arms because he wasn't fast enough, strong enough, ruthless enough. Tonight would be different. Tonight he wouldn't let history repeat itself. The warehouse emerged from the darkness like a sleeping beast. Rain fell harder, drumming on the metal roof like thunder. Stefan signaled, and the convoy stopped 300 meters away. Theo assigned positions. 10 men sealed the rear exit. 10 flanked both sides. 10 went with Stefan straight through the front door. The remaining 2 stayed outside with the vehicles, ready for extraction. We move in 3 minutes, Stefan ordered over the radio. No one escapes. No one fires into the room holding the hostage. I'll handle Tony myself. 3 minutes stretched like a lifetime. Then the signal came. Gunfire ripped through the night from every direction. Lights inside the warehouse flickered on, then died as someone cut the power. Screams, running footsteps, shattering glass mixed with the rain into a chaotic symphony of violence. Stefan stormed through the front entrance, gun in hand, his silhouette a ghost amid smoke, rain, and muzzle flashes. 2 guards fell before they could aim. 3 more rushed out and were taken down in seconds by Stefan's men. He didn't slow. He didn't think. He moved forward like a machine programmed with a single purpose. Find Miles. Save Miles. burn anyone who stood between him and that child. The warehouse became a dark maze, lit only by gunfire, and the occasional flash of lightning outside. Stefan moved down corridors, stepping over bodies, hearing gunshots and shouting echo all around. Then he heard it, a child's cry, small, terrified, but alive. Miles. Stefan's heart nearly burst with relief. He charged toward the sound, kicked open a steel door at the end of the corridor, and saw Tony Russo in the corner of the room, one arm dragging Miles against his chest as a living shield, the other pressing a gun to the boy's head. "Stop, Volkov," Tony screamed, his eyes wild in the darkness. "Stop, or I'll shoot." Stefan stood there, gun still aimed forward, rain pouring through the hole in the warehouse roof onto his shoulders like the sky itself was bleeding. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in brutal clarity. Tony Russo was trembling, sweat mixed with rain streaming down his face, the gun in his hand pressed hard against Miles's temple. And Miles, a 7-year-old boy with wide blue eyes, was terrified but not crying. He looked straight at Stefan as if trying to say something his mouth couldn't form. "Put the gun down," Tony screamed, his voice shrill and shaking with panic. "Put it down or I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." Stefan didn't lower his weapon. He didn't advance either. He just stood there, gray eyes cold as steel, measuring the moment with the calm of someone who'd seen too much death to flinch. "Tony," he said evenly, "how do you think this ends?" "I walk out of here," Tony said, dragging Miles backward toward the rear door. "You let me go. And when I'm safe, I'll let the kid go." Stefan shook his head slowly. "You know I can't do that. And you know if you hurt that child, you won't just die. You'll wish you were dead." Tony swallowed. He knew Stefan wasn't bluffing. All of Chicago knew the stories about how Stefan Volkov dealt with enemies, but he was already too far gone to turn back. "This is your fault," Tony snarled. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You took my face for a waitress. You think I'd let that go? So you kidnapped a child?" Stefan said, his voice still steady but something dangerous boiling underneath. "To soothe your wounded ego, you dragged a 7-year-old into this. You really are your father's son. Don't mention my father. I'm mentioning your whole family," Stefan replied, taking one slow step forward, calm and deliberate, as if there wasn't a gun pointed at the boy he loved like his own. Moreno built his empire on rules. No women, no children. That was the law. That was what separated us from animals. And you broke it. Don't come any closer. Tony backed up until his spine nearly hit the wall. "I said don't come closer." Miles looked at Stefan, and despite the fear, his lips moved. "Stefan." Just one word. Not a scream for help. A statement. "I trust you. I know you'll save me." Stefan felt his heart tighten until it hurt. He looked at Miles, at the child used as a shield who still believed in him, and he remembered Katya, her eyes in that final moment, the way she'd looked at him as if apologizing for dying, as if it were her fault. He hadn't saved Katya, but he would save Miles, even if it killed him. "Tony," Stefan said, slowly lowering his gun and placing it on the floor. "You want me, not the kid. Let him go. I'll stand here and let you leave." Tony blinked, disbelief flooding his face. Stefan Volkov surrendering. "You think I'm stupid," Tony said, but his voice wavered. "You'll shoot me the second I turn my back." "I'm not carrying another gun," Stefan said, raising both hands. "My people are outside and I'll order them to let you go. You've got 1 minute to disappear before I change my mind. Just let the kid go." Tony hesitated. He looked at Stefan, at the gun on the floor, at the door behind him. Greed and fear warred in his eyes. Then he made the mistake. He lowered the gun from Miles's head for just a second, trying to shove the boy aside and run. 1 second was all Stefan needed. He moved like lightning. No gun, no weapon, but hands trained to kill since he was 16. His left hand knocked Tony's gun aside at the exact moment the trigger was pulled, the bullet slamming into the wall inches from Miles. His right hand crushed Tony's throat with enough force to collapse the airway. Tony hit the floor, choking, gasping like a fish on land. The gun skidded away. Stefan didn't stop. He mounted Tony and struck him once, twice, 3 times. Each blow a silent vow. For Miles, for Emma, for Mason, for Katya. For every child men like Tony thought they could use as leverage. "You won't die quickly," Stefan whispered into Tony's ear, his voice so cold it barely sounded human. "You'll live long enough for your father to see what you've become." long enough for him to understand the price of touching what's mine. Stefan stood, leaving Tony choking in his own blood, and turned to Miles. The boy was curled in the corner, shaking, eyes still wide but no longer afraid. When Stefan reached him, Miles threw himself into Stefan's arms, small hands gripping his waist as if letting go meant falling into nothingness. Stefan dropped to his knees and held him tight. He felt the small body trembling, felt hot tears soak into his shirt, and he tightened his hold as if he could shield the boy from the entire world. "Are you hurt?" Stefan asked hoarsely. "Anywhere." Miles shook his head against Stefan's chest. "I'm okay," he whispered. "I knew you'd come. I told them Stefan would come, and they'd be sorry. And they are sorry, right?" Stefan felt his eyes burn. For the first time in 12 years, tears ran down the scarred lines of his face, and he didn't care. He just held the child who'd trusted him when the world feared him. "Yes," Stefan whispered back. "They're sorry, and no one will ever make you afraid again. I promise." Rain kept falling through the broken roof. The distant gunfire faded, and in a room filled with darkness and the smell of blood, a Mafia boss knelt on the floor holding a 7-year-old boy as if he were the whole world. Because he was. The boy, his mother, and his brother had become Stefan's world without him even realizing when. Stefan stood, lifting Miles into his arms, and carried him out of the warehouse. Rain poured down, washing over him, and he let it. Some blood never washes away. But he was willing to carry tonight's blood for the rest of his life, if it meant Miles was safe. On the drive back, Miles didn't let go. He sat in Stefan's lap in the back seat, head against Stefan's chest, listening to the heartbeat slowly settling. Then he asked, his voice barely a breath, "Stefan, can you be my real dad now? I don't want to pretend anymore." Stefan looked down at the boy in his arms and didn't need a moment to think. "Okay," he said, his voice as solid as a vow. "If you want, from now on, Stefan will be your real dad." Miles smiled for the first time since the kidnapping and fell asleep in Stefan's arms, as if there was no safer place in the world. When the SUV stopped in front of the penthouse building, Emma was already waiting in the lobby. She couldn't sit still in the high apartment, couldn't bear staring out the window while not knowing whether her son was alive or dead. Mason sat beside her, hands clenched into the chair, eyes fixed on the glass doors as if staring hard enough could force time to move faster. Then headlights cut through the darkness. The car door opened, and Emma saw Stefan step out with Miles in his arms. She ran. She couldn't remember ever running that fast in her life. Rain was still falling, cold and heavy, but she felt nothing except the need to touch her son, to know he was truly here, truly alive, truly safe. "Miles," she cried, the name breaking in her throat. "My baby." Miles heard his mother's voice, lifted his head from Stefan's shoulder, his little face crumpling as he cried and smiled and cried again. "Mom." Stefan passed Miles into Emma's arms, and she held him as if they'd vanish if she let go for even a second. She sobbed, tears mixing with rain, unable to say anything except her son's name over and over. Mason ran to them, throwing his arms around his mother and brother, the three of them standing there in the cold lobby that felt warmer than anywhere on earth. "I'm sorry, Mom," Miles said through tears. "I scared you." "No," Emma shook her head, kissing his hair. "It's not your fault. It's never your fault." Stefan stood there watching them, rain still soaking him, the blood on his clothes slowly washing away. He didn't step into the embrace. He didn't think he belonged there. He'd done what had to be done tonight, and what he'd done wasn't something you brought into a normal family. Emma looked up at him through her tears, and she saw it, the blood on his hands, the bruise darkening his cheekbone where someone had landed a blow, the exhausted eyes of a man who'd gone through hell and come back. "Go inside," Stefan said hoarsely. "It's cold. The kids need rest." He turned as if to leave, but Emma grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" "I need to finish a few things," Stefan said without looking at her. "Moreno needs to get the message. Tony needs to be delivered to his father. And Rick." He paused. Rick was arrested with Moreno's people. He'll be handed to the police with all the evidence of aiding a criminal organization. This time he won't be getting out early. Emma nodded, but her hand didn't let go. "And after that?" Stefan finally looked at her. "After that, you're free," he said. "Moreno won't dare touch you after tonight. Tony will spend months recovering, and when he wakes up, his father will teach him what it costs to break the rules. Rick will be in prison." You're safe. You can go anywhere you want. I'll make sure no one can find you." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and she realized something. He thought she wanted to leave. He thought that after seeing him tonight, after knowing what he'd done, she'd be afraid and run. He was giving her a way out without guilt. He was protecting her from himself. "Mason," Emma said, turning to her older son, "take your brother inside. Dry him off and give him some warm milk. I need to talk to Stefan." Mason nodded, took Miles's hand, and led him into the elevator. The doors closed, leaving Emma and Stefan facing each other in the empty lobby, rain still falling beyond the glass like a curtain between them and the world. "You think I want to leave?" Emma asked. "I think you should leave," Stefan replied bluntly. "You saw what I am tonight. I didn't just threaten Tony. I nearly beat him to death with my bare hands. I killed people to get to Miles. My hands are bloody. Not for the first time and not for the last. You shouldn't be near someone like me." "You know what I saw tonight," Emma said, stepping closer, close enough to smell rain and blood on him. "I saw a man burn the world down to save my son. I saw the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago kneel and hold a 7-year-old like he was the most precious thing in his life. I saw a monster," she admitted, her voice steady and unafraid, "but a monster who belongs to us." Stefan stood there, speechless. "I don't need a prince on a white horse," Emma continued, placing her hand on his chest over his racing heart. "I don't need a clean man with hands that have never hurt anyone. I need someone who'll stand between my children and the dark. Someone who'll do whatever it takes to protect us. And tonight you proved you're that man." She looked up at him, eyes red but unwavering. "I don't want to leave. I don't want freedom from you. I want to be here. With you. If you still want us." Stefan looked down at her, at the woman standing before him soaked through, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes telling him she wasn't afraid of his darkness, that she accepted all of him. "I'll always want you," he said thickly. "From the moment you walked into my life, I wanted you, but I was afraid I'd drag you into hell with me." "Then we'll be in hell together," Emma said. "And maybe we'll make it home." Then she did what they'd both been waiting for. She rose onto her toes, pressed her lips to his, and kissed him there in the cold lobby filled with the sound of rain. Stefan froze for a heartbeat, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then he wrapped his arms around her, pulled her close, and kissed her like a drowning man finding air. Like someone frozen for 12 years finally finding warmth, like a monster being told by an angel that he was worthy of love. Rain kept falling beyond the glass. The blood on Stefan's clothes still hadn't fully dried. The world outside remained dark and dangerous. But in each other's arms, they found what they'd both thought was lost forever. A home, a family, a place to belong. 6 months passed like a dream no one wanted to wake up from. The penthouse that had once felt like a tomb was now filled with laughter and warmth. Mason and Miles had started attending a private school near home, with discreet security watching from a distance, though it was hardly necessary anymore, because after that night, no one in Chicago dared think about touching the Volkov family. Frank Moreno had signed a ceasefire after receiving Tony back barely alive, along with a message that this was the first and last warning, and he understood it. Rick Lawson was sitting in a federal prison with a 20-year sentence without parole, and Emma could finally hear his name without her hands shaking. Life slowly became normal in a way none of them had ever believed possible. Stefan still ran his empire, but he came home in time for dinner every day. Emma continued working remotely as an editor because she refused to become completely dependent, and Stefan respected that. Mason stopped blaming himself for the kidnapping and began smiling more. Miles kept asking the strangest questions and kept making ugly but delicious cookies every weekend. They had become a family, not on paper and not through vows, but through shared breakfasts, nights when Stefan read to the boys, moments when Emma rested her head on his shoulder while watching a movie, and the way Mason said Stefan's name, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Stefan wanted more. He wanted to make the unofficial official. He wanted Emma to know she wasn't just someone living with him. She was the woman he wanted beside him for the rest of his life, and he knew he had to do it the right way. One evening after dinner, while Emma was washing dishes in the kitchen, Stefan motioned for Mason and Miles to come into the study. The boys sat in the chairs across from him, curious. "Stefan has something to talk to you about," he began, realizing his hands were shaking slightly. He had faced enemies, walked through gunfire, killed without blinking, Yet sitting in front of two 7-year-old boys made him more nervous than anything ever had. "Stefan wants to marry your mom," he said plainly, because he didn't know another way. "Stefan wants her to become his wife, and Stefan wants to be your father, truly and officially, not pretending anymore." Mason and Miles looked at each other, then back at him. "Why are you asking us?" Mason asked, tilting his head. "Because you're part of this family," Stefan replied. "And this decision affects you as much as it affects your mother. Stefan can't marry her if you don't agree. You chose Stefan that night at the party. Now Stefan is asking your permission to stay forever." Miles grinned. "So Stefan will be our real dad. If you agree, Stefan will be your dad." Stefan nodded. "And you can take the Volkov name if you want, or keep Lawson. It's your choice." Mason was quiet for a moment, his two wise blue eyes thinking. Then he stood up, walked to Stefan, and did something that nearly made the Mafia boss cry. He hugged him. "I agree," Mason said, his voice thick. "I want Stefan to be my dad. I want Mom to be happy, and she's happy with Stefan." Miles jumped down and hugged them both. "I agree too," he said. "But Stefan has to buy us a dog, you promised." Stefan laughed. The laugh of a man who had forgotten he could. "Deal," he said. "We'll get a dog." 20 minutes later, Emma walked into the living room and froze. Stefan was down on one knee, a black velvet box in his hand. Mason and Miles stood on either side of him like honor guards, faces serious but eyes shining. Emma lifted her hand to her mouth, tears already falling before he spoke. "Emma Lawson," Stefan began, his voice trembling but steady. "6 months ago, these two boys walked up to my table and asked if I could pretend to be their father. I didn't know then that saying yes that night would change my life completely." He looked up at her, gray eyes no longer cold but full of love. "I lived 12 years in darkness, thinking I didn't deserve the light. Then you came, with your two incredible sons, and a heart big enough to accept even a monster like me. You taught me I don't have to be perfect to be loved, that scars don't make me broken but make me real, that family isn't something you're born into but something you choose." Stefan opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant diamond ring, perfectly Emma. "I asked Mason and Miles already," he said, "and they agreed to let me be their father. Now I'm asking you, Emma Lawson, will you marry me? Will you let me love you, protect you, and stand beside you for the rest of our lives? Will you let us turn 4 lonely people into a real family?" Emma cried and laughed at the same time. She stepped forward and knelt so she could look him in the eyes. "I agree," she said, her voice shaking with happiness. "I agreed a long time ago. The night I chose to stay, the moment I realized the most frightening monster in Chicago was the gentlest man I'd ever known. I agree to be your wife. I agree to give our children a father worthy of them. I agree to build a family with you, in light or in darkness." Stefan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. Mason and Miles rushed in, turning it into an embrace of 4. They stood there in the living room of a penthouse, once cold as a grave, now as warm as any happy home in the world. Some love stories begin with a first glance, some with grand designs of fate, but theirs began with 2 brave boys, a whispered moment at a party, and a bold question, "Can you pretend to be our dad?" Stefan had stopped pretending long ago. Now everything was real. Real love, real family, real happiness, beautiful, messy, and perfect in every moment. This story reminds us that love can come from the most unexpected places, that family isn't always blood but those who choose to stand together through every storm, that even hearts frozen solid can melt when they meet the right people, that sometimes children see what adults miss, and their small courage can change entire lives, and most of all that no one deserves to be lonely forever. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Like and share this video so more people can hear meaningful stories like this every day. We would love to know how you felt about Stefan and Emma's journey. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in an unexpected way? Do you believe love can heal the deepest wounds? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly listen from the heart. We say goodbye for now, and look forward to seeing you again in our next video, with even more moving stories. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Remember that no matter how hard life feels, there's always someone out there waiting to love you. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye and see you again.